Thank you for joining the November 2021 VMware TAM customer webinar. This webinar is organized by the VMware TAM organization to provide our customers the opportunity to hear great content and interact directly with great speakers that are delivering it, with the goal of making sure that you are getting full benefit from your software. Please make use of the Q&A feature to ask any questions, and if your question doesn't get addressed today, be sure to reach out to your TAM and ask them to follow up. Before we get into today's content, there are just a couple of basic announcements. Our next TAM customer webinar will be on December 2nd, and we'll have the privilege of being joined by Jiten to talk about removal of SD card USB as a standalone boot device option, detailed in KB article 85685, for those that want to check out more information before that session. As I mentioned earlier, we want you to benefit from these sessions by interacting with the speaker. So if you have any questions during today's webinar, please use the Q&A feature of Zoom and we'll address them during the webinar. At the end of today's session, you'll be prompted to fill out a simple survey related to the value received from this session and any topic suggestions for the future. Your completion of this survey is a very valuable gift back to us, and we'd greatly appreciate it. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded and your TAM can make the recording link available to you. After a few months, the recording will be publicly available on the VMware TAM Services YouTube channel. That brings us to today's speaker and topic. Bob Plankers is a cloud infrastructure security architect and will be talking to us about securing vSphere installations through strongly worded message of the day greetings, among other options.
Oh,
Bob,
you're killing
please
me,
go ahead.
Brian. You're killing me. Thank you very much. Thank you for calling this content great. I hope to live up to that. My name is Bob Plankers. I am indeed I'm a technical marketing architect. I just actually got reorganized into the VMware Cloud group as well. And so I get to bring, not only do I get to talk about vSphere, but I get to talk about the cloud now too. And that's pretty exciting for me. But yeah, happy to be here. I'm going to talk about current, if I can get my clicker to work here. There we go. I actually present at my desk with my clicker. It makes me feel normal. I want to talk about current topics in security and compliance. If you've got questions, put them out in the Q&A and I'll pick them up as we go. We'll just get going here. I've got a bunch of stuff I want to talk about. There's a lot going on in the security world. There's always a lot going on, but we seem to be paying attention to it more and more nowadays, and that's both a good and bad thing. But this talk is going to be a little bit of a winding journey, as many of our security journeys have been. We're going to go up and over the mountain here and see what other mountain peaks we need to climb. But in general, my agenda today, we'll talk a little bit about VMSAs and vendor security notifications. The fact that a lot of change right now is being driven by fear. Ransomware groups are the monster under the bed, the boogeyman, whatever we want to call them, that we've always needed to spur organizations to actually make investments in security. Unfortunately, it's not the greatest, doing things out of fear is not the greatest reason to do stuff. It'd be nice if organizations did things proactively, but hey, we'll take it where we can. Some misplaced trust, some thoughts about, areas that we could do a little bit better, especially around the zero trust areas. So we'll talk about some features and functionality. Windows 11 has been a popular topic. Their insistence on a VTPM or a TPM being available to Windows 11 is interesting, and we'll talk about how we deal with that. We'll talk about native key provider a little bit too. Try not to duplicate things, but really just trying to tie a lot of stuff together. Resources, where to look for more information moving forward, and then we'll just do Q&A, mop up if there's any other questions left. So getting into it here, if you drop off right now, the only thing I want to really get across to you is, if you're not subscribed to the VMware Security Advisory's mailing list, I urge you to do so. Go out and sign up for them. You won't get any marketing emails, nothing. There's no spam. The only thing I like to joke that the only thing you'll get is bad news when you sign up for this thing. You'll get notified that there's a vulnerability in a product. VMware, we like being transparent about it, because the truth is that attackers find out about these things. We'd like the defenders, the blue team of the world. There's red team, the attackers, and the blue teams, the defenders. And I've always been on the defense side of things. And the attackers truly The attackers only have to get lucky once. The defenders have to be on their game all the time. So knowing as much as you can, knowledge is definitely power in information security. So sign up for this. I also urge you, VMware products, vSphere in particular, have a lot of dependencies on things like Active Directory. And Active Directory is not, not devoid of security vulnerabilities as well. Not throwing Microsoft under the bus. I think they would agree. It's also a huge target for attackers because of its role in enterprises. The fact that Active Directory is so successful as an authentication source and authorization source, and that makes it a huge target. And so signing up for these advisories from Microsoft will help you as well, help you make decisions. I want to talk a little bit, ways that we see organizations being compromised. vSphere is not without vulnerabilities and things like that. We know that. We own it. We're trying to do better. We're doing a lot of work to do better on that front. Stuff I don't want to talk about here. I probably shouldn't talk about publicly, but we're doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes, and to make sure that it's secure and safe. But the truth is that vSphere is usually buried inside of organizations. The management interfaces are buried inside of organizations. So organizations have attackers coming in a variety of different ways. Stolen credentials, a big one. Authentication, authorization. That's the biggest way that we see vSphere environments getting hit is actually just through Active Directory. Finding out an attacker is able to compromise some credentials. They're able to escalate their privileges. They become domain admin. They drop themselves into the right Active Directory groups, and then they can go manage the firewalls. They can go manage vSphere. They head over to vSphere because everyone's running their big workloads on it, right? I think it was the CrowdStrike people that actually this last February called it big game hunting. The idea that these attackers are not dumb. They're very smart, and they're in it for the money. Millions and millions and millions of dollars are at stake. Billions of dollars are at stake here. And so they go where all the big workloads are, where they can have the most impact and try to get you to pay a ransom, and that's often vSphere. Remote access, RDP, people leave RDP open to the internet. SSH open to the internet. They don't protect it very well, that sort of thing. Coupled with vulnerabilities in these protocols, vulnerabilities in these systems allow attackers to get in, and it really comes down to knowing what you have, asset inventories, knowing what you have, being able to make sure that it's patched, that sort of thing. Email and links, huge. People, most of security is a people problem, quite honestly. And people are awful. No, I kid. I like people. I have missed people in the last year and a half here, but people have bad days. And this include vSphere admins. vSphere admins are people too. And, tell your organization, newsflash, but, have bad days. You get a phishing link in there. You click on something that you shouldn't, and then the attackers have, go to a malicious link, malicious ads. And, it's just the security landscape is awful in that regard. And, you get your desktop compromised, a desktop in your organization's compromised. And then usually the user account that's logged in there is also compromised. If that's a domain account, then that's a problem. If it's a domain admin account, that's awful. That's really why we try to separate those things. But email, malicious links, things like that really, really have to play into our thinking moving forward here. Trust between systems. I put this in here. The biggest example of this has been the SolarWinds class of attacks, where we discovered that, hey, inside of our organizations, our monitoring systems have access to everything, and so those become big targets. Configuration management systems, how do we protect those? How do we limit? Can we limit the trust there? Can we put controls around it? That sort of thing. And then workload vulnerabilities too, not patching workloads, because workloads are, you think about it, you punch holes in firewalls so that other customers, downstream customers, your customers can access these workloads. Infrastructure isn't there just on its own, it's there to support workloads, to move businesses forward. And you punch holes in firewalls so that things can use those workloads and use the applications. But if those applications have a vulnerability, can they get into the guest OS? From there, they're inside the network. They're inside the corporate network, and what can they get to? That sort of thing. And so, really putting some controls on that. And Brian mentioned, banners and stuff like that. Things attackers, every week I get asked about basically 5 things. Cipher suites. Cipher suites are a big thing. The vSphere supports TLS 1.2 right now. TLS 1.3 is out there, and there's new cipher suites. Those are on our roadmap. Don't worry, we're moving it forward. But attackers couldn't care less about cipher suites. Compliance folks care deeply about cipher suites, but that's not how people are getting in. Certificates the same way. I'm a big fan of replacing default certificates myself, because it's usually kind of a breadcrumb to tell me that something's wrong, like establishing that trust. But going crazy about it, I don't know. PTR records. This is one of my favorites. Security personnel in organizations that refuse to put reverse DNS or PTR records in there because it might give away information about an environment. Yeah, it might give away information to like the sysadmins. I don't know. There's always a balancing act here, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Like these systems have to be usable to the people that need to use them, right? And making it hard on sysadmins, making it hard on vSphere admins generally doesn't pay off as much as you'd think it might. CPU vulnerabilities, certainly we should evaluate them for risk, but there's a lot of obscure CPU vulnerabilities. My favorite is the MSC PSC ones from a year and a half ago, that if you enable it, you get like the performance of Microsoft Device Guard and Credential Guard. VMs that are using that will often go in the tank because of the mitigations from Intel. And and you look at it, and the attack is pretty obscure. And so this is a situation where turning security to 11 doesn't really pay off. And so thinking about the risk, thinking critically about it, what you might lose, doing some testing is really important. And then last, my favorite, SSH and RDP banners. These folks are criminals. The people attacking you are criminals. And so telling them that they're doing something illegal probably just clues them in that they're going in the right direction, And so spending a lot of time messing around with this is just crazy. This is not me, by the way. As much as I'd love to say this is me, this is actually me, patch your stuff. But, when it comes right down to it, like I was saying, security is a trade-off with everything else. Security and usability, like we often think that security is more complicated, more complex. Usability, erring on the side of usability makes things more simple. Security is more involved, and that's often true. Usability, usable systems are more manageable sometimes, but then we think about some other things: higher cost and lower cost, higher risk and lower risk. And these are really unfounded assumptions that something that's more secure has a lower risk. And I put out there to you the idea of air gaps. Air gaps are one of my favorite examples of how more security actually goes backwards in many cases. Air gaps tend to make systems so hard to manage. You can't just push the button to patch. You can't just, you can't do anything easily with an air gap. And especially in the day and age of cloud-based things and automatic updates and stuff like that, those things are there to help you. And so adding a gap, adding something that prevents those things from helping you often means that the vSphere admins, and I've lived this personally, that because it becomes hard to manage those systems, people they don't monitor them like they should. They don't patch them like they should. And ultimately the risk goes up the more for some of these really high security things, unless you're really prepared for the implications of things like air gaps and whatnot, and so turning it to 11, as the movie quote goes, turning it to 11 is not always a good idea, and security, talking about cost, for example, something that's secure might not actually be higher cost in the long run, especially when you think of a ransomware payout, making an investment ahead of an attack making an investment in security and business continuity and DR practices and things like that often pays off. It often lowers the cost in the long run. But unfortunately, it's hard sometimes to get people to think about that. Well, we're talking about other core concepts. Do some level setting here. There's other things. The CIA triad. I apologize if you've seen a talk from me before. I always cover the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability, because I think it's really important to think about other aspects of IT as being security related. We always think of confidentiality as being security, the idea that we're keeping our data out of the hands of bad actors, out of the hands of criminals, people who are not authorized to see it. We keep it out of their hands, but that's only part of it. That's a third of it. Integrity, the idea that if we leave a system somewhere, if I leave data somewhere, I want to return to it and have it be in the state I expect. I don't want it to, and it's not even attackers necessarily. It's bit rot on disk or whatever. Availability, big thing. We pay for these systems, right? We want to use them. And conversely, when we're not using them, we want to be able to maintain them and stuff like that. But they're there to use, right? Otherwise, why did we build them? The nice thing about the CIA triad is it lets security people and security-minded people get their fingers in absolutely everything, because all vSphere features address risk in some way and can be mapped back into confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I've done that here as an example, but pretty much everything in vSphere can be mapped here. And then, the last of my marketing slides, I'll move on. I am in marketing. The nice thing about vSphere is it underpins pretty much everything. So doing this stuff and learning about this stuff and having these practices on your on-premises environments leads itself directly to the other things that vSphere powers. Other things, defense in depth. I like talking about defense in depth, the idea that we have overlapping security controls, overlapping independent security controls, so that if one fails, maybe we have a vulnerability, maybe there's an authentication problem, whatever. Patching is an overlapping control, a compensating control for having extra drivers and hardware installed on a guest VM for guest OS, for example. Firewalls are often thought of as the defense, and usually the biggest example of defense in depth, where a firewall helps control access clearly. And so we had some spectacular news around this last spring. I like making fun of ourselves a little bit. The InfoSec community really likes their memes, and this last spring, when it was discovered, when there was a root compromise or remote code execution vulnerability in vCenter, somebody looked at Shodan.io. If you're not familiar with Shodan.io, searching for your own IP ranges and that, it's a search engine for IoT sorts of things and things that maybe shouldn't be on the internet. Somebody actually looked in there and like, holy buckets, how many people put vCenter server directly on the internet? Not that we don't think that vCenter should be able to hang out on the internet, but there's no defense in depth there. Sure, you made it easy to get there, to get access to it, but now it's easy for the attackers too. I also like talking about the idea of compensating controls. I mentioned it earlier. This is often a compliance sort of thing, and I put it out there not to talk about compliance. Compliance is a business requirement. It's really important to understand compliance versus security. Compliance is a business requirement. It allows an organization to run a hospital, take credit cards. Who doesn't like getting paid? To run a nuclear power plant, whatever. It's a regulatory thing, and sort of levels the baseline, levels a playing field in the industry. But it's kind of a minimum, and a lot of these regulatory compliance things, that's where you see the SSH banners, all that sort of stuff. Shutting SSH off, for example, is a compensating control for not setting the SSH banner. Why do you need an SSH banner when you don't have SSH to start with, for example? And so compensating controls are something that vSphere admins can definitely learn. It's a piece of terminology that helps you talk to your auditors. Auditors understand compensating controls. And so I give it to you as a gift. Being able to talk to auditors using their own language usually means good things, and lets the auditors help you, and you can get along with them a little bit better. Separation of duties. I like mentioning this, the idea that more than one person should be required to complete a task in an organization. Banks have been doing this sort of stuff for a long time. Banks also do something that's really interesting to me. They send people on mandatory vacations for a couple of weeks every year so that fraud and other things can be exposed while those people are absent, that sort of thing. And so separating where we can. I know a lot of smaller organizations can't do this, but bigger organizations might be able to, and it's something to think about. Least privilege. We talk a lot about least privilege. We do not as much of it as we talk about it. I was directly a sysadmin for 23 years, and I was a VMware customer for many of those years. And I get it, as a sysadmin, as a vSphere admin, you just want to see something work. Setting up a new system, you're not quite sure of the permissions in all of these systems, Windows, vSphere, Linux, all that stuff can be complicated. So you give it root, you give it administrator, that sort of thing. And you say to yourself, it's the biggest lie ever. You say to yourself, I'll come back and fix it. No, you won't. I never did. Hopefully you're better than I was. And, you move on, you forget about it. Some other burning emergency comes along and you forget about it. Hey, it works, right? Well, doing it right from the beginning needs to be part of our practices moving forward. And so I urge people to do that, because especially zero trust. We talk a lot about zero trust. We've heard immense amounts of conversation about zero trust. There's a lot of talk about zero trust, and it's getting to the point where I think people are getting kind of worn out by it. Zero trust is not something you can buy. It's a design concept. It's there's things that support zero trust and zero trust methodologies and that, but it's a design concept. You have to design it into your systems. The idea, it's kind of like it's part, in my opinion, it's part of least privilege. The idea that we're not blindly trusting systems. We're not blindly trusting that my desktop, the person at my desktop, is me. We're not blindly trusting that, where we need to be checking identity more and more. And so that's really important. And it really kind of came to a head when the United States president put it in one of their executive orders about zero trust for the US federal government. That really spurred a lot of stuff on. But I always compare it to castles. This is a Spanish castle. I'm not quite sure which one it is, but castles are a great example of this, because this is the typical corporate network. There's a moat. Well, the moat is drained here, and maybe not the most effective security control, but there's external security controls, perimeter security controls. There's big walls. There's a gate. There's probably some guards at the gate. There might even be some guards internal at certain checkpoints and choke points there to get into the keep and whatnot. But generally, once you're inside the walls, you can kind of wander around as you wish. There's not a whole lot of security controls inside. We need to morph our organizations a little bit into having internal security controls. And this is the former American prison Alcatraz out in the San Francisco Bay. It's got a moat. It's got the San Francisco Bay that's really cold and filled with sharks and stuff like that. And it's got big walls, it's got cliffs, it's got guards on the outside, but it also has internal controls because it was a prison, and not saying that we need to turn our IT infrastructures into prisons. I hope you don't think of vSphere that way. But the internal controls, the internal checkpoints, the monitoring and the controls and the authorization in that's something we need to work on internally. Like organizations, not one big happy family. Like we need to have some guardrails and some checkpoints inside. And to that end, like I want to talk a little bit, I said I'd talk a little bit about common types of trust in our organizations that maybe we need to think about a little bit. And Active Directory, I mentioned this earlier, centralized directories, the idea that organizations put all of their eggs in one basket, and they have all of their authentication and all their authorization in here. So all somebody has to do, if all an attacker has to do, they send somebody a malicious link on Friday, and the employee's tired, whatever, they click on it, they maybe shouldn't have clicked on it, whatever, it's done. They have a domain user account. If you haven't patched your Active Directory DCs for a while, there's probably some vulnerabilities that you can you become domain admin, and then you get the run of the place, and that's pretty scary. You can do whatever you want. They just drop themselves into the different groups, and then they can log in as admins. And when you can do that, then they can shut off other security controls and that on all these systems. They can The worst case I've ever heard about is managing firewall access that way. That admins of firewalls were governed through, at an organization, were governed through Active Directory. And so the attackers were just able to, shut the firewalls off and add exceptions for themselves. That's pretty scary. So what do we do about it in vSphere, and the vSphere derivatives out there? Instead of importing, if you do have to use Active Directory, and Active Directory is well, using Active Directory is nice because you can participate in HR processes, like if so-and-so in your network operations center quits over the weekend, HR can just deactivate their account, that sort of thing. But at least do the authorization. So there's authentication and authorization. Do the authorization through SSO instead of pulling in a vSphere or an AD group like here, like a VMware vSphere admins group coming from my AD domain in my lab. Pull in individual users. And this is nice because, one, doing it this way prevents AD admins from adding themselves. That's actually a story I was told a couple of years ago when I mentioned this at the last in-person VMworld. Somebody approached me afterwards and told me a nice story about their AD admins adding themselves to groups and things like that and logging in and checking it out. But it also prevents AD attackers from adding themselves, which is the whole point here. Makes attackers, in this model, they have to compromise a very specific account. In this model, I'm using separate accounts, an administrator account, so that if my desktop account, maybe I log into my desktop as Plankers, if I do click on something, I'd like to think I'm better than that, but I'm not, and sometimes I click on dumb stuff too. The, vSphere admins are humans. We may not want to admit it, but that way, if they get my desktop account, they don't get my admin access. They have to try a little bit harder for it. And that's the point. We want them to work for this stuff. And because when they work for it, we catch them. We see them doing this stuff. We can monitor for it. We can monitor logins and failed logins for Plankers-ADM, that sort of thing. If your desktop account is compromised, and so in this model, they have to find and compromise Plankers-ADM. And so when I can't log in, maybe they change my password. That's easy enough to do if you're a domain admin. But I'll notice that, and that's the point. And then the last point I like making here is it's easier for you as a vSphere admin to audit this. You don't have to ask the AD admins to audit who's got administrative rights into vSphere. You can look at it directly, that sort of thing. So practicing my meme game, AD groups for authorization, bad. We should use SSO for authorization. And there's actually ways to automate the Power CLI. There's a Power CLI module to automate user and group creation and management in vSphere. And so if you're interested in that, that's actually really cool because, maybe we can get away with not using AD for authentication for vSphere as well. Maybe we can automate some of that too. So other things I like pointing out, common types of trust. Often organizations build a lot of trust between their DR sites and their primary sites. Is that a good idea? I don't think so. And I see this a lot with enhanced link mode. Nothing wrong with Elm. Elm works, and it's a great solution if you need to federate vCenter servers and vSphere implementations and things like that. But Elm copies things between the SSO implementations. It replicates things between the LDAP instances on the back end. And so if there's something wrong, maybe there's an attack, maybe even a bug that, not that vSphere would ever have bugs, but maybe, vSphere 6.7, the GA version of it, actually had a bug that bit me here and took out, when I was a customer, took out my DR site along with my primary site. And that's, I scratched my head and said, that's not good, and especially thinking about ransomware and all that stuff, having direct links there might not be the best idea. And so I urge people to really think about that and build some isolation, not just internally, but between their DR sites and the stuff that they need for business continuity as well. Out-of-band hardware management, the iDRACs and ILOs and xClarities and Cisco whatevers and all that stuff of the world often have USB NICs that you can turn on, and those are backdoors. these devices, and like an iDRAC, for example, I'm going to pick on Dell EMC because I have deep familiarity with the iDRACs, and I like the iDRACs. I really do. I just don't like them as a backdoor to my systems. And so installing additional software there, I try to avoid that. Like iDRACs, there's a whole API for them. You can use rack ADM as a command. You can download that. There's whole CLIs. They can do all kinds of stuff on their own. You don't have to create those backdoors there. SSH, great backdoor for an environment. You don't need SSH. And if you do think you need SSH, if you do need it for something, turn it on, do your thing, and turn it off again. And by and large, you probably don't need it, especially with vSphere 7, where we've got APIs for everything now. Plugins and that vulnerability from last spring, where the remote compromise was in the plugin architecture of vCenter Server and the vSphere client. Really got folks thinking about, and there's been a lot of great work done in organizations. Our customers have done a lot of great work to separate the plugins. It's great that you can install a plugin to manage your storage and your backup and all that sort of stuff. But if somebody gets admin access, if an attacker gets admin access to vCenter Server, then they've now got access to your backups as well. Is that a good idea? No, that is not. You don't want them to. Backups are your last line of defense. You absolutely don't want them being that easy to get to. In fact, some of our partners, Veeam, for example, I'm sure Commvault and other folks have this as well, but I know Veeam has got stuff in their documentation about it never attaching their backup systems to AD, never attaching their backup systems to shared infrastructure like that, and that's good advice. And then last, and we've kind of been talking about this, infrastructure perimeter security controls, and it really comes down to, hey, why can the CEO's desktop get to the vSphere management interfaces? This is a question that should be asked all kinds of places, because when it comes right down to it, if you ask me, if you want to protect yourself, you treat vCenter Server as being something for vSphere admins. You make the workload admins go in through RDP or SSH into their workloads directly. That makes security controls a heck of a lot easier, because you can audit that. You can use the NSX, IDP, IDS, IPS, not IDP, but IPS, IDS to monitor that stuff and track it. You can do all kinds of stuff there. And workload admins don't need console access. And if they think that they do, they probably don't. You probably just need to learn about the RDP clients / console flag to get to the console of their VM, So when somebody asks for it, this is one of my favorite things, just say no, but you go, Bob, one does not simply tell the CEO that they can't have access, right? Well, sure. Okay. And this is where I get manipulative and devious. That's where you turn to the VCSA firewall, or in the ESXi firewall. You file a change record saying you're going to tighten up the rules for this stuff. And you put in there, you use the firewalls here. Maybe you don't have, maybe the perimeter firewalls are pretty loose, and you should tighten those up. But you can do this on vCenter Server as well. You can add firewall rules. In this case, it's my lab, and I've got a few different subnets in here. But get pretty restrictive about it. Just like I point out here, make sure you add the allow rules before you add the deny. Otherwise, you're going to have kind of a bad day. You can log into, if you can get to the console again. You can log into it, and it's just this front end's the Linux firewall on the VCSA itself, so you can clear that stuff out or reboot it and that sort of thing. But so anyhow, why are we doing this? Because ransomware. Talked about fear. Ransomware is that boogeyman, the monster under the bed that we've needed to move our organizations forward. And I want to talk a little bit about ransomware. I mentioned earlier that these folks are criminals. They're not hackers. Hackers is a loaded word. There's a whole bunch of people. The movie industry has made hackers look like bad things, but there's all kinds of people that really have a problem with that terminology. And so, I don't like calling them hackers. They're criminals, refer to it as what they're doing. They're criminal theft. They're bad actors, threat actors, whatever you want to call them, but they criminal theft, criminal extortion, criminal blackmail rather. They engage in phishing, malware, attack trusted systems. We talked about that. One of the big things though that people don't really realize is that they're patient, they're insidious. There's an IBM study that's out there from earlier this year that shows that breaches, the average breach is 200 days long. That's the average breach. And so these folks are patient. They wait, they make asset maps. Heck, like people, I've often joked that people paying the ransom should demand that the asset inventory that the attackers have as well. It's probably better than the one you've got. And it's not just about encryption. They do this and they extort, they copy your intellectual property. They look for ways to blackmail you and your customers. Think about a law firm. If you're a law firm and you have a lot of secrets for your own clients stored there, these folks will copy them off. They'll exfiltrate that data somehow, get it off the network, and then they'll extort and blackmail your own customers. And in some cases, we've seen there's triple levels, 3 levels of extortion, triple extortion, that they're blackmailing your customers' customers, and that's awful. That's reputational damage. And then paying the ransom doesn't guarantee anything. Again, these are criminals. And a couple of examples, this is from 2015, that the ransomware decryptor doesn't work. It turns out these organizations are not super interested in quality assurance around their ransomware decryptors. And so lots of complaints there. This is actually the Colonial Pipeline attack in the US, the East Coast of the US. They ended up they paid the ransom, they got the decryptor. The decryptor was so slow, they ended up just restoring from backup anyhow. Second, we've noted that the industry has noted that basically when you pay it, that means you probably haven't fixed what the problems were. And these groups, these ransomware groups, all kind of work together. There's a whole ecosystem there. They turn it over to their partners, and their partners take a shot at you as well. You look like an ATM to the cyber criminal underworld there, and that's not good. And then, like we were talking about, double extortion, triple extortion. But yeah, the whole thing requires a change in attitude. The change in attitude when it comes to pretty much anything we're doing for security nowadays is that the assumption that attackers are probably in control of a desktop somewhere in our organization. We don't like believing this, but I urge you, if you don't think I'm right, if you say, Bob, you're wrong about this. We don't have any attackers on any of our desktops in our organization. I said, great, prove it, and so hopefully you can. That would be great. Likewise, attackers are probably in control of a user account, usually associated with the compromised desktop. And when it comes right down to it, organizations need to start thinking that they're going to be attacked, that organizations will experience an attack. And it's grim. It's really grim. But if you shift towards thinking about things this way, you really start making different decisions. You really start getting prepared. And most organizations that think about things this way actually have prepared for it. And they're the ones to survive attacks. They're the ones to catch them. They're the ones that patch faster, because they know that often the difference between a critical vulnerability and an important one is just authentication. And if the attackers have the ability to authenticate with a domain account or whatever, then that changes the whole thing, right? They're able to take advantage of some of these vulnerabilities that come out in various products. And so, speaking of patching, I really believe that patching is a process problem. We need to spend more time educating our change managers and our management that rebooting vCenter server doesn't impact workloads. vMotion exists and is set up, and it's risk mitigation. It moves workloads around, and once I did this personally, I was able to, the change managers and my management, when I was a customer, had no problem with me working on these systems during the day, doing patching during the day, and especially with the improvements to vMotion and vSphere 7, where vMotions are really not noticeable by most workloads now. That's huge. And so being able to do this stuff during the day when you're awake and actually at work and paying attention, and you have people around to help you, immense bonuses there. I also remind people that if you can't patch it during business hours, how are you going to survive a real failure? Patching is really just a small scheduled test of your resiliency, right? And so, yeah. We've got a ransomware, kind of tie this off here. We've got a ransomware resource center that I built out on core.vmware.com. I've got a paper, practical ideas for ransomware resilience, that's out there. A lot of these ideas, people and process ideas. I know as techs, We don't like the nebulous sort of people and process side of things, but it's worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about some of the stuff. Heck, if there's nothing else you take from it, the idea that you need to know who to call when everything is down, that's a problem that I ran into again as a customer. We had a power outage, and who do you call? Well, it turns out all of the phone numbers were stored on systems that were down. We ended up printing out the phone list and using a magnet to attach to the metal door of the data center. That was kind of fun. Let's talk about security features. Lots of security features in vSphere and VMware Cloud Foundation and VMware Cloud on AWS and stuff. Let's talk about a few things here, especially on-premises stuff. TPM 2.0. We don't require a TPM in hardware yet. We're probably going to at some point in the future, but they're inexpensive. They're $40 US. They're not installed by default on servers. And I think that's criminal negligence, but to not just have it built into the chipset itself. Don't tell Intel and AMD and Dell and HP that I said that, but I think that you shouldn't have a choice, that you should always get a TPM. But right now you do have a choice. I urge you to choose installing a TPM. It's a great way to store secrets. So it becomes a secure enclave. You talk about secure enclaves. We often hear about secure enclaves when law enforcement makes the news. A terrorist or an attacker or a criminal has an iPhone, for example. iPhones have got a secure enclave and that stores secrets, and law enforcement can't get in there. And so hey, we like that. We want that same functionality for our secrets in our environments too. A TPM itself is a serial device. You think about it more like a modem than anything. It sits on the system board. It's modular. This one happens to be the one that's one of the ones in my lab environment. I pulled it out to take a picture of it, and it just sits on the system board. It operates 115.2 or whatever. It's not fast. It really isn't fast. People ask about performance of vTPM. The emulated, the virtual TPMs that we do in vSphere are much faster because they are not a serial device. This one, the hardware one, belongs to ESXi. No workloads can touch it. And we want that. ESXi keeps its secrets here. And if you want to keep secrets in the workloads, we can use vTPM, which is based on VM encryption. We'll talk about that in a minute. And if a workload were to store secrets in a hardware TPM, how would it vMotion? We don't want that. So ESXi, as I mentioned, stores its encryption keys for native key provider. Configuration encryption. Configuration encryption is an interesting thing that came along in vSphere 7 Update 2. Encrypted configuration on disk, so that all of passwords and things like that aren't stored in the clear anymore on ESXi. There's some implications there for being able to do rescue boots and things like that, where some of those old techniques aren't possible anymore because the systems aren't, the configuration and boot volumes are encrypted now, and so that's kind of interesting. TPMs, because they're storing things that are secrets, they're storing it locally. If your whole server is stolen, the secrets go with it too, and ESXi will be able to unlock it. We've got a question out here. Just a comment about patching and moving workloads around with no impact. Tell this to Cisco, who does have an extended list of apps that officially does not support vMotion. Oh yeah, I know this. I've seen this movie before. I started it as a customer. They don't officially, there's a lot of vendors actually that don't officially support vMotion. It's because they don't want to deal with the situation. It's CYA for them is what it amounts to. And for Cisco as well, especially their VoIP stuff, Microsoft and their Link or Skype for Business or whatever they're calling it now. It was Link back when I was dealing with it. A lot of that stuff, yeah. And so if that's truly a requirement, so when I was a customer, I often convinced the workload admins to let's try some vMotion, and in most cases it was fine. For stuff that was really hardcore, we cannot vMotion it. I need to be able to, we need to be able to maintain the underlying systems. And so we just designed around it that, we give them notice, but my team was just able to, and would use change windows like during the middle of the day. We're going to do our ESXi patching during the middle of the day. And we would use DRS rules should rules, to kind of pin a workload to a particular host. We would save those particular hosts for certain time periods throughout the week, and we'd give them notice, but we just issue a guest shutdown, and we'd let a layer 4 load balancer or whatever take over from there. We just had to architect around it, and we didn't make it an option. It was a discussion, sure, but our ability to patch the infrastructure was absolutely important, and because that solid foundation, keeping that foundation secure, keeps all the workloads secure too. And so, yeah. So yes, I feel your pain. Thank you. Good comment. Okay, back to TPMs. Physical TPMs are not virtual TPMs. They have nothing to do with each other aside from the TPM spec that they both implement. One is physical and belongs to ESXi. The other one is virtual and belongs to the workloads and VM encryption. One of the things we added to vSphere 7 update 2 was native key provider. The idea that with vSphere 7, you don't need an external KMS anymore in order to enable VM encryption, vSAN encryption, VTPM, things like that. And that was a big, we're asking customers, hey, why don't you turn this stuff on? And the KMSs are another design point. They have to be made very available. Sometimes there's political boundaries that people don't want to deal with, that sort of thing. And so native key provider's been really, it's been great. People have really enjoyed it so far. And I got to say, in some of my materials about it, I mentioned that it's great for lab environments and that it's great for production too. I should actually re-record that and say that it's great for everything. But there's some considerations, pros and cons, right? Considerations. It only serves vSphere clusters. So if you've got a storage array or a tape library or something else that needs a KMS, something that speaks KMIP, you can't use native key provider for that. A native key provider is only for vSphere. It takes care of vSphere clusters, and that's that. The hosts will have a key derivation key pushed to them. And so this is the key derivation key. With VM encryption, traditionally we called it the key encryption key, and that's stored in a KMS. vSphere native key provider has a little bit different operation there, but it's sort of similar. Key derivation key will end up on the host, and I'll show you that in a second here, so that the hosts it eliminates a dependency loop. So the host can unlock their stuff and unlock VMs and that, especially in HA situations, that sort of thing. vCenter server backups have the key material in them, the KDK, and that. So you should be securing your vCenter server backups anyhow, because they've got passwords and all kinds of stuff in them, but it's even more important now. Benefits, it's really easy to enable. I'll show you that in a second. The idea that you can turn it on and not, yes, Alvaro, you can use it to rotate keys. You can manage the keys. You can rotate the keys through the VM policies in the UI or with PowerShell. And so you do that. That's what I mean here with it's flexible. You can graduate to a KMS. You can move to a KMS later if you want to, but it helps you really not have to write data in the clear to SSDs. And flash devices are, well, there's a lot, as the next talk is going to talk about, the differences between flash devices. One of the things about flash is that most flash devices are a little bit intelligent. SD cards are not, unfortunately, and that's the crux of the problem with using them. But in SSD, like a SATA SSD device or an M2, whatever, has more storage on it than because the truth is, every time you write to flash, you destroy it a little bit. And so if you write to the same spot over and over and over again, you'll wear it out. And so what these devices do is they move the writing around. They call it wear leveling. And to help compensate for wearing stuff out over time, they actually have more memory in them, more flash memory in them than they present to the operating system. So like right now on my desk here, I've got a 480 gig SSD drive that I'm staring at. It's an Intel S3500. It's a little older. And it's got 525 gigs of storage in it. And so that it can do sparing and all that stuff. But what happens when you want to sanitize the whole thing? That's a big problem. And most organizations that are worried about it end up destroying these things or making a giant pile of them in their data center, rip them out of servers and pile them up. And, so if you can avoid writing to them from the beginning by using a technology like native key provider, even if you don't want to stay there, and long term, that really helps. It helps the data sanitization sort of thing. But yes, so rekeying, rotating keys, you can rotate vSAN keys, you can rotate VM keys, you can do a shallow rekey, a deep rekey. Here, let's actually move forward. And so I'll talk about this a little bit. There are two keys when you're encrypting a VM. One, with native key provider, there's a key derivation key, or it's also called a key encryption key. With native key provider, this key is pushed out to the hosts so that the host can restart. Think about a situation where vCenter server is running inside the cluster itself. Needs to be able to HA restart vCenter server. And so we don't need any single points of failure. We don't want single points of failure here. So this key is pushed out there. If you've got a TPM in your hosts, it'll be stored there. And that's a secure thing to store it there. If you don't have a TPM, it'll just store it on disk as part of the config encryption, the encrypted configurations, that sort of thing. This is why we urge TPM usage, but it's a choice when you're turning this on. And then a VM that you want to encrypt, you get this thing known as a data encryption key. So there's two keys. Data encryption key encrypts the VM components, and the data encryption key is then stored with the VM. And you think, Bob, isn't that dangerous? Well, it isn't, because we encrypt the VM encryption, or the data encryption key, the thing the VM is using. We encrypt that with a key derivation key. So there's two levels of encryption here. You might say, well, that sounds pretty dumb. That sounds extra complicated. Well, we're a virtualization company, and we believe that more layers of abstraction help solve problems. One of the problems is vMotion. Another problem is replication. What if you want to take this VM and replicate it somewhere else? And so the key to unlock it goes with it. And then you can control the key derivation key. You can control who has access. And technologies like vSphere Trust Authority, something else that was introduced in vSphere 7, really work to help control how those keys are distributed. So if a host doesn't pass attestation, looks compromised, vSphere Trust Authority will revoke its ability to access the cryptographic keys. And so it can't unlock VMs and things like that. So works pretty slick. Everything still works. vMotion works. I get asked from time to time, how hard do we have guidance on setting it up? And it's so easy. This is a real-time recording of me configuring it. And the hardest thing about this is giving it a good name, because if how do VMs find their key provider? They find it via the name. And so if you have to export this, what you can do is you can export this key, the KDK, and you can import it at your DR site, for example. And then your DR site can unlock replicated VMs. And so you can give it a password when it requires you to back up the KDK the first time. It won't let you use the key provider until you back it up, and you need to put this key in a safe place, because it's going to be important should you need to restore it, or should you need to add it to another vCenter server somewhere. But like I said, giving it names so that you don't get a name collision if you import it somewhere else, that's really important. So, but yeah, it's from here. This is, like I said, this is a whole recording. From here, you can turn on VM encryption. You can add a VTPM. In fact, my next slide is adding a VTPM. You can just go into edit settings, go up to add new device, trusted platform module. If you've got a key provider added, and done. And what it does is it'll encrypt the VM home files. So the NVRAM file on disk is now encrypted. You can go on to encrypt the VMDKs if you want. You can be very granular about that. You can also it works well with vSAN encryption as well. Maybe you don't want to do double encryption of the VMDKs, but you can VTPM, and all this stuff works really well together. So, and then speaking of working well together, you add these two and you can get Windows 11. We get a lot of questions about Windows 11 lately with the Trusted Platform Module 2.0. What you see here is Windows 11 saying, hey, I've got a TPM 2.0, and that's a VTPM. It works great. It looks just like a normal TPM. And so some questions that we get from time to time, actually pretty much constantly for the last month and a half. Do I need to encrypt my whole VM to use VTPM? And the answer is absolutely not. You can just encrypt the home files, and it does that. If you add VTPM, it does that for you. If you're already using vSAN encryption, you can add this, no problem. Like I said, just consider what might happen if you're doing double encryption. There's always, we talked about security being a trade-off, and performance is a trade-off too. Anytime you're doing encryption, you'll lose a little bit of performance. Base VM encryption it depends on the workload. It really depends on the workloads and the CPUs and that. We like to tell people that it's mid-single digits of performance hit. Some are going to be worse, some are going to be better, that sort of thing. But if you're double encrypting, it multiplies, it's not linear, that sort of thing. Let's see. Is ADFS the recommended method to implement MFA for vCenter 6, 7, and 7, or are there other better options? So officially with vCenter 6, 7, the MFA, there's secure RSA secure ID. And there are some techniques for, like Duo has an LDAP proxy, for example, that can be used to insert MFA as part of the 80 over LDAP stuff. But MFA for vCenter 6, 7 is really just RSA secure ID. Those techniques are still available. Well, and also smart cards too. Smart cards are a form of multi-factor authentication. Those are supported as well. vCenter 7 has all of those. It also has Identity Federation, which works with ADFS. A lot of organizations don't like ADFS. ADFS isn't the greatest solution, but it was a good starting point for us because a lot of other things plug into it. Right now, that's the recommended method for implementing MFA for vCenter server. Moving forward, expanding that, we're actually trying to bring the workload one broker or Workspace ONE identity broker, the VIDM stuff, into vSphere directly, so that that opens up. We were hoping to do that. If you've seen talks of mine before about this, we were hoping to do that as part of vSphere 7 here, but it looks like it's more of a future thing. There's been some technical complications there, but being able to support the Oktas and pings and Azure ADs of the world are really, really important to us. And a lot of OIDC based IDPs and that. So yeah, so that's the way to go right now. In thinking about separating what I was talking earlier about, separating your authentication and authorization. I know a lot of organization. How close? I can't speak about futures. I'm hoping it's very close, though. And I'm hoping it ships soon, but I can't give you a time frame on that because, well, I don't like making promises because I'm not actually allowed to make promises. Get into trouble. So hopefully soon. But yeah. What was I talking about? Oh, there's some organizations that have stood up just small ADFS implementations, added two-factor authentication support to those just for their infrastructure itself, and to separate themselves from their organizational infrastructure. That they still use AD, but the AD that they use is behind their own secure perimeters. It's managed differently. It's monitored all the heck. There's all kinds of monitoring on it, and it's separate from corporate AD, so that if the corporate AD is compromised for some reason, then they're not compromised at the infrastructure level as well. So are there caveats to VTPM? Getting back to the VTM stuff, security is always trade-off. Cloning a VM makes an identical copy of the VM, and that includes VTPM itself. And so you can't, one of the things about VM encryption with native key provider is you can't rekey a VM with native key provider while it's being cloned. That's also true of vSphere Trust Authority too. We're looking at fixing that. How do we make that a better experience moving forward? But also caveats of VTPM, you've now got an encrypted VM, and so you need to make sure your backup software supports it. Most do. Most require, if you're using the hot add methods, that you need to encrypt. You need to turn on encryption for the proxies, the backup proxies that you're using. But most backup vendors that support it, they all have a documentation on how that works. It's pretty straightforward. Windows, another question that comes up with Windows 11 that I just kind of wedged in here. Windows 11 isn't on the list of supported OSs in vSphere. Well, It is actually supported and listed as supported in the VMware compatibility guide, our hardware compatibility list. It's just not listed in the product itself. Windows Server 2022 came out earlier and we knew more about it, but the final GA version of Windows 11 was still a little nebulous whether they were going to require it or not, and how we were going to finalize our support for it. So it's in progress. If you want to use it right now, use the Windows 10 guest OS setting. Works just fine. Create a VM, a Windows 10 VM, go ahead and create it, add a VTPM to it after you create it, and then you can install just as you would normal operating system. Another question we get, does Windows 11 absolutely require VTPM to be installed in a VM? This is more of a question for Microsoft, but we can answer it. Microsoft says yes, so we're obligated to say yes too. There are instructions on how to get around it. Not that I copied them from the web and you can take a screenshot of them right now, but if you want to run it in your lab on hardware that isn't supported, there are some ways around it, and don't call me if this doesn't work. Don't call me don't call VMware. The official way of doing this is add to VTPM, and actually there's VTPM support in Workstation and Fusion as well. You just have to encrypt the VMs. So inevitably somebody at this point asks if the slides will be available. Yes, the slides will be available after this talk as well. Does Windows Server 2022 or Windows 11 need anything else? You should be you should be using UEFI firmware at this point, and secure boot. Don't use the old BIOS based stuff. That stuff is dead. Everything for the last 10 years or so has supported secure boot. And when you're building new templates for this stuff, just turn it on. It's a checkbox. And this is the way, as they might say in The Mandalorian. So TPM 2.0, I copied this slide forward here. TPM 2.0, we talked about that. Add it to your hosts, add it to your VMs where you need it. UEFI secure boot, add it to everything you've got. It's way easier to turn it on when you're doing new installs than to try to retrofit, changing the BIOS. I had somebody tell me the other day, like, hey, you're wrong when you say that you can't switch between BIOS and UEFI and all that stuff. And then they sent me the documentation for Windows, and the documentation is basically doing a whole system reinstall. And so, I like to think that, there's a stalemate there, but it's just easiest if we turn it on to start with. So do that. Isolation and separation. Yeah, keep things separated. Keep the workloads separated from each other. Keep all the workloads separated from the infrastructure. There's no reason any of that stuff needs to touch any of the vSphere admin interfaces, that sort of thing. And then last, I like talking about EVC. And you might say, Bob, is EVC really a enhanced vMotion compatibility? Is it really a security feature? And it adds flexibility. Well, one, I think everything in vSphere is a security feature, but two, it really adds a lot of flexibility around growing the cluster and CPU vulnerabilities. We do a lot of stuff with EVC with CPU vulnerabilities when they come out to help smooth differences, because CPU vulnerabilities, a lot of times when there's a CPU vulnerability, Intel and AMD will ship new microcode for the CPUs themselves, and they add instructions to the CPUs. And so when you get the new microcode on a host for your CPUs, you actually look like you have a different CPU between systems that have the same CPUs in them. And that becomes a vMotion problem, because all of a sudden you can't vMotion back and forth. If you've got EVC turned on, and a lot of folks don't, and because it's not part of the cluster quick start. That's actually something that we're looking at fixing, but people don't think about it right away, and you need everything in the cluster to be off to turn it on. And so if you don't do it right away, it's hard. I actually did this a couple of times. I had a couple of clusters that I inherited back in the day that didn't have EVC on, and actually we ended up having a power outage, one scheduled, one not, where with everything down, I actually turned on EVC while it was all off, and that worked out. But that's a little sketchy. You want to turn it on when you're building something. And so moving forward, just keep it in mind. When you build a new cluster, turn on EVC. A lot of times people say, well, isn't there a performance hit? Well, what it's doing is it masks out the differences in CPU instructions between the CPUs, so that a newer CPU that has different sets of CPU instructions, your guest OS won't come up and use those and then not be able to move to an older CPU, which doesn't support all the same stuff. Some workloads actually need those things, and we have something called per VM EVC. And so if you've got a workload that needs the newer CPU instructions, you can actually just on a VM by VM basis say that even though your whole cluster is set to Cascade Lake, that you want a particular workload to be Ice Lake, or whatever. And so that's the way around that. But generally, there's not, most enterprise software doesn't care too much about that stuff, and the performance, any performance differences are really not around CPU instructions. It's usually other things. But resources. So we're getting towards the end here, and I appreciate all of you. If you've got any questions, now is a good time to put them out there. We'll clean up here in a little bit and take care of any questions that are out there. But resources, talking about stuff in the future, we've got core.vmware.com. I've got a security page out there that's got a bunch of stuff on it. Compliance, if you're interested in regulatory compliance, maybe you like to think you're not interested, but you're forced to be interested. We've actually got some really great kits out there for helping your auditors understand the security controls in vSphere and Cloud Foundation, and coming soon VMware Cloud on AWS and things like that. The helps the auditors understand what you've done as to secure the environment and how that maps into regulatory requirements. How does a particular PCI DSS requirement requirement, how is that implemented in, how would you implement that in vSphere? And that helps immensely. So check it out. We've got a YouTube channel. In fact, pretty much all of our products have a YouTube channel. The TAMs, Brian said earlier that the TAMs have got a YouTube channel as well. And so this talk will be up there in a couple of months. But if you subscribe to the YouTube channel, the vSphere one, I'm going to continue doing my vSphere Live monthly sessions, even though I'm a cloud guy, like it's all related. I'm going to continue doing the live streams every month, and so you'll get notification if you subscribe. Ring the bell, as the kids say. I mentioned subscribing to the VMware security advisories. Please do that. Please subscribe to other vendors, the other vendors that you use, to their security advisory mailing lists as well. I mentioned the ransomware group. And then the Venerable Security Configuration Guide, vSphere, and expanding that into vSAN and things like that. A new version was supposed to be out in October, and I'm sorry about that. If you've heard me talk before and I mentioned it, I have decided to expand it a little bit to cover some design principles and things like that. So people, as it turns out, people use this. It wasn't ever meant to be a checklist, and people just use it as a checklist. And how long am I going to fight against people trying to use it as a checklist? So I just embrace it. If it's a checklist, here's a bunch of other stuff you should think about. Physical security, I've got physical security in there as well now, and that sort of thing. vSphere hardening, John, you're saying vSphere hardening is still a very manual process and time consuming. Why have we not come out with appliances with some of these settings already configured? Well, you mentioned that I realize some of these settings can break certain functionality, but a lot of these settings are photon based, seem like they can be done before releasing to customers. Well, I agree with you. And actually there's a team within engineering, our engineering groups, that agree with you as well. And we're working on that as we move forward, changing that stuff. You'll see. So like the difference between the security configuration guide and things like DISA STIG hardening, and that the STIGs have to comply with various US federal government stuff. And so and those requirements are really stringent. And so, there's a lot of stuff in product. Most of the stuff that's listed in the STIG guidance, for example, is actually set by default. And so we're trying to reconcile that as well. Do we need to have all of that stuff? Because frankly, ESXi is more like network switch firmware than it is a full multi-user operating system. And so what's the right balance there? The feds say do it all. And we just haven't found the right words to disagree with them effectively yet. The hardening guide, the security configuration guide, we can take a different stance where, and actually for a future major version release coming in the future, I actually just went through the hardening guide, and anything that isn't set by default, I actually just asked our engineering folks to make it the default. And so, yeah, it would be really nice if the hardening guide just became an audit guide. All you have to do is check some of the stuff and maybe add some of your own things like NTP servers and DNS. So I'm on board with you, and that's a great question. George asks, why is the vCenter firewall only IP based? Well, that's the way firewalls work. DNS requires that if it was DNS based, I guess some of the Palo Alto networks firewalls and stuff like that can do DNS based stuff, but they have to resolve that name every once in a while. And the Linux firewall doesn't really do that. And so it's built on, the VCSA is built on Photon Linux, and it uses IP tables underneath everything. And it doesn't have the ability to resolve a DNS entry. So right now we're still stuck with IP. No option to configure ports. That's an improvement. That's a roadmap item. So yeah, configuring ports would be cool. We are actually driving most interactions with ESXi and vCenter server into port 443 though. With vSphere 7, we added a reverse proxy so that, especially for certificate management, instead of having hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of certificates, now we really only have one certificate per host or one certificate per appliance, so that, and it's just given to the reverse proxy. So most of that stuff is going to be proxied through port 443 anyhow. Let's see, John, I've read some good postings by you. Well, thank you. Around the hybrid process regarding self-signed certs. What is your advice around implementing hybrid certs, et cetera? Should this become the de facto standard moving forward? Certificates are a great way to make a lot of work for yourself. I'll just put it that way. And something that some customers and I, a bank and a large healthcare organization, and I kind of figured out a couple of years ago was, it dawned on me, why don't these hybrid mode is great. I'll take a step back. So there's basically a couple of different modes you can run in. You can replace all the certificates in vSphere manually, and that's a lot of work. You can use hybrid mode. You can use subordinate CA mode, where you have the VMware Certificate Authority, which is a component of the vCenter server that manages the certificates. You can have it issue certificates that are compatible with your corporate identity providers and PKI infrastructure and stuff like that. Then you can have the VMCA just issue its own self-signed stuff, which is the default. You can just inherit that. There's a lot of small organizations that do that. And then there's also this idea of hybrid mode, where you can choose any of those other ways of doing it, and you can just replace the vSphere client certificate. So you can still have a self-signed certificate on the back end for ESXi and all of that stuff through the VMCA, and you can just replace the vSphere client itself, and replace that certificate with something that's well known and checks all the boxes for trust. So that's hybrid mode. But the subordinate CA, most people are worried about the subordinate CA stuff. They don't want to use the self-signed or default. It's created when you install vCenter server, but the VMCA has a self-signed certificate, and there's a lot of folks that don't want that. But doing the subordinate CA scares them, because their PKI people don't want to give the vSphere admins the ability to sign things on behalf of the whole organization. If that key material becomes, if it gets lost or it's stolen or whatever, all of a sudden, then the vSphere admins can sign applications and sign websites and all kinds of stuff and impersonate the organization, and they don't like that. So one of the things that a lot of folks have been doing, and where I started saying a couple of banks and a couple of healthcare organizations, and I kind of worked out, is why don't they just invent a CA for infrastructure themselves? How many people are really going to be accessing the ESXi management interfaces? You don't need trust for the whole enterprise. Some teller at a bank does not need to be able to trust the ESXi management interface. And so that's an approach. A lot of PKI folks actually really like it. I've had people laugh at me when I suggest it because it's simple. The PKI folks create a CA that's only for infrastructure and their infrastructure teams. They don't have to worry about blast radius and all that stuff. The infrastructure teams love it because they can do whatever they need to do and they don't have all these rules and that. And then they can also use the automation that's part of the VMware environment that's there. You can have the VMCA do its thing and really save a lot of time and effort there. So. Mike, hey Mike, see you in a few weeks. In fact, Minneapolis. But will port level firewall rules be coming? So ESXi has got some semblance of port level firewall rules because of the services, being based on services. I believe there's improvements slated for the VCSA as well, but I don't want to make too many promises. I tend to try to talk about what's on the truck right now and not what will be on the truck in the future. So for right now, it's IP level stuff. And moving forward, yeah, I can imagine that. But also remember that moving forward, we're really trying to get it to just port 443. And so, and really limit the other port sprawl and things like that are out there. And so, yeah, but being able to do egress rules would be really nice, port-based stuff. And so that's a conversation we've been having with our engineering group. And yeah, so I'll leave it as roadmap. And it's a good time also to suggest that if you have feedback, we can get you in touch with product management. Your TAMs can suggest it to our product management group. Also in the vSphere client itself, there's a little smiley face, and maybe you aren't feeling as smiley as the face implies, but little smiley face in vSphere 7 up on the upper right-hand side that you can submit feedback directly there. And it goes into the same systems that TAMs and even I submit things in. And then periodically, PM actually just did that the other day. In fact, went through everything and reclassified, assigned feedback to all the different product managers. And there's been a bunch of that stuff that has been suggested that we've actually made improvements in the product. There's some folks that it takes a little bit. I'll tell you that our release time frames, native key provider, for example, was something that I suggested to VMware when I joined VMware almost 3 years ago. And so it takes a little bit for the feedback to show up in the product. I talked to a number of people that say that the feedback mechanisms are terrible and nothing ever happens. Things happen. It needs to get in the roadmap. And this is not just true of VMware, it's true of all software development stuff, because it needs to get in the roadmap, needs to be assessed. There's UX designers that need to weigh in on it. Our user experience designers, that's one of the biggest things about VMware that I like, is that we really worry about how humans are going to use this stuff, that sort of thing. And so, there's a lot of process there before it shows up. And sometimes the feedback would be a breaking change, and we can't really do that in the middle of a major release either. And so because our partner ecosystem gets really jumpy about that, and because all of their stuff breaks, and they don't like that. So a lot of stuff we have to wait for a major version. And so, yeah, you'll see people who have submitted feedback, you'll probably see a bunch of it with the next major version that comes out. So I guess we're doing Q&A already. Those are great questions. It's great to see a bunch of you out there. If there's anything left, now's the time. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up. And I will say that I really appreciate all of you. Thank you for being our customers. Thank you for feedback. Feedback is a gift. I know some people say that mockingly, but I actually really like the feedback because it helps us. I can say something to our product managers and to our engineers, but having an actual customer say it means a lot. And so I really appreciate you all.
Thanks, Bob. This was really useful content today. Thank you for presenting. We'll keep an eye here on Q&A, but as there's none right now, I just want to kind of close up. As we mentioned at the beginning, the presentation was recorded, and your TAM can make that recording available to you. And then please join us next month when we'll be discussing removal of SD card, USB as standalone boot device options. We look forward to seeing you again on December 2nd. Thanks.
Thank you all. Take care. Thanks, Brian.